Well, welcome to another edition of Weird News and Wacky History, a look behind the scenes of what's been happening throughout the years. I'm your host, Pastor Roland Moss, that old history dude. If you were alive in the 60s, you remember the crazy things that were going on. So join me as we travel back to Beatles Mania. It was the early 60s and rock and roll was hot. Boy bands, girl bands, garage bands, and basement bands were springing up everywhere. One hopeful out-of-town group landed an audition with Decca Records, and on New Year's Day of 1962, they recorded a demo for producer Tony Meehan. They worked hard to copy the sound of the American stars Buddy Holly and Chuck Berry and laid down 10 tracks, mostly covered by U.S. bands. Among the recordings on the demo that day were Money, That's What I Want, Like Dreamers Do, Three Cool Cats, Memphis, Tennessee, Take Good Care of My Baby, Sure to Fall, Love of the Loved, Till There Was You, Searchin', and Crying, Waiting, Hoping. Decca executive Dick Rao ultimately rejected these fledgling rockers, claiming authoritatively that guitar bands were on the way out and that these guys obviously had no future in show business. Decca instead chose Brian Poole and the Tremolos, a local group they figured would be just as good and would cost them a whole lot less in travel expenses. And so Paul McCartney, John Lennon, George Harrison, and Pete Best, to be replaced within a few weeks by Ringo Starr, tried again at EMI and never looked back. But somehow they needed to crack the American market. The Beatles swept England by storm in the early 60s, but they just weren't clicking across the pond. After intensely wooing Capitol Records, Brian Epstein, the group's manager, was rejected by company execs. Undeterred, the Mop Tops decided on a far more American sound. Paul McCartney and John Lennon sat down to write a song with a distinctly gospel sound. Sitting nose to nose at the piano in Paul's current girlfriend Jane Asher's basement, they were thumping out chords and jotting down lyrics. I'll let John tell what happened when the musical lightning struck. Paul hits this E minor chord, and I turn to him and say, "That's it." I say, "Do that again." In those days, we really used to absolutely write like that, both playing into each other's noses. With the help of British label EMI, Epstein persuaded Capitol to give the Beatles a chance. So on December 26, 1963, the Fab Four released their first American gospel tune, I Want to Hold Your Hand. The song sold 10,000 albums an hour in New York, and Capitol had to subcontract other labels to press recordings just to keep up. The Beatles also made sure to sing it on The Ed Sullivan Show on February 9th and 16th of 1964. The British Invasion was definitely on. But even the Beatles had a musical hero they admired. It was August 27th of 1965, and the Beatles were on their second U.S. tour. The night off, they dropped by to visit Elvis Presley at his Beverly Hills mansion. They agreed in advance there would be no press, no photos, and no recordings. It was just like a dream, really, meeting Elvis, remembers Sir Paul McCartney. We'd fantasized about him since we were kind of young teenagers, and here he was in the flesh, so it was great. It was lovely. They sat and talked about music for a while, and then Elvis let them play around with his guitars, and they jammed for a bit. So, what was it that amazed the Fab Four the most about their visit to the king of rock and roll? His lavish lifestyle? His many gold records? Actually, it was something else entirely. He had the first remote television channel changer that we'd ever seen, because, it was that year when they came out, continued McCartney. He was just aiming it at the TV, and the channels were changing, and we'd go, "Whoa, he is indeed the mighty God. He can turn the channels without approaching the television set." So we were mighty impressed by that. Ultimately, the Beatles would even help topple the Soviet Union. During the brilliant chess matches between Anatoly Karpov and Garry Kasparov in the mid-1980s, the two grandmasters were asked to name their favorite composers. Anatoly Pushmatov, laureate of the Lenin Komsomol Award, answered the straight arrow party-line Kasparov. John Lennon, replied the progressive Karpov with a smile. Beatlemania made unexpectedly deep inroads behind the Iron Curtain of the 60s. Russian youth were so utterly infatuated with the foursome that they used their songs to help them learn English. Soviet officials, in their totalitarian fashion, reacted with an iron-fisted prohibition of all Fab Four music. Soviet youth responded by sporting mop-top haircuts. Old-line communists called these shaggy dissidents Harries. Police routinely rounded up these mop-top youngsters and herded them off to the nearest police station for a quick clip to a state hairstyle. But the more the authorities cracked down on the bugs, as the Soviet media sneeringly referred to them, the worse it got. Eventually, the Beatles' song Girl was released, but obscurely listed as Dyavushka, Russian for girl, an English folk song. No matter how the officials opposed it, an entire generation of youngsters listened to black market Beatles tapes and screamed their way into independent thinking. The Soviet Union was doomed by a fatal infestation of the bugs. And that's about all the time we have for this episode of Weird News and Wacky History. A look behind the scenes of what's been happening throughout the years. I'm your host, Pastor Roland Moss, author, historian, and speaker, hoping that all of your history may be just a bit weird.